Betrayal didn't kill me. It rebirthed me. Now I'm ready to wield my secret weapon and burn down the false world he built. I stood in the dusty, damp silence of the basement, holding the manila folder like it was a live grenade. 52 years old, and in this chilling moment, I realized every truth I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my husband, Julian, was a beautifully constructed lie. The realization didn't bring tears. It brought an Arctic coldness, a terrifying clarity I hadn't known I possessed. The documents were a tapestry of deceit, shell company transactions, diverted client funds, enough to buy a small island, or in Julian's case, a second life in the neighboring town of Stonehaven. The centerpiece was the notarized deed to a modest, charming cottage bearing the name Scarlet Reed, and a photo of Julian standing beside a woman and two teenagers, all smiling under the blinding summer sun, a complete family unit, separate and flourishing for the last 2 decades. Julian's footsteps on the main floor signaled his return from the late meeting he always had on Tuesday nights. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the electric surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment of truth that would either break me or forge me anew. I ascended the stairs, the folder pressed tight against my tailored silk blouse, a shield and a weapon. He saw the folder first, then the expression on my face, a mask of absolute finality. The smirk he wore moments before, the one that usually accompanied his lies, vanished. Julian Thorne, the formidable bank director, suddenly looked like a small, terrified boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Eleanor? What is that? His voice was forced, a desperate attempt at control. I walked past the Italian marble table in the foyer, the one we bought on our 25th anniversary trip to Florence, a trip I now understood, financed by money meant for his other children's college fund. I stopped directly in front of him, closer than I usually stood, close enough to smell the subtle, unfamiliar cologne he wore only when he went to Stonehaven. Don't worry about our children right now. Julian, I said, my voice low, steady, and utterly devoid of warmth. I was shocked by its cold efficiency. Worry about what you'll tell the bank's ethics board when they receive copies of these financial records. These, I tapped the folder lightly, are not just love letters. These are federal crimes. It was my first high-stakes bluff, drawn from a deep reservoir of wounded pride I didn't know I possessed. The change in his face was immediate and horrifying. The color drained away, leaving his features skeletal. I felt a savage, bitter satisfaction. For the first time in 27 years, I held the reins of power. He was the one trapped, the one fearing the ruinous consequences of his double life. What? What do you want, Eleanor? His voice had dropped to a pathetic whisper, the tone of a man begging for mercy. Tell me what I need to do for this. This mess to stay just between us. I rose slowly, deliberately, meeting his desperate gaze. The polished confidence I had always admired in him was dissolving like sugar in hot tea. I want you to leave my house, tonight. My command was absolute. Take only what you need, a few clothes, your briefcase, but leave everything else behind. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the expansive foyer, taking in the symbols of the life he was about to forfeit, the antique grandfather clock, the hand-painted porcelain vases, the portrait of our family commissioned 10 years ago. Tomorrow, we will discuss the terms of the divorce. Divorce? He seemed genuinely, ridiculously stunned, as if after all this, I was still expected to play the part of the devoted, forgiving wife. But what about our legacy? Our standing in Willow Creek? The audacity of that question was a physical blow, a slap across my face. Our legacy. Our legacy ended the moment you signed the deed to that cottage in Stonehaven, Julian. After maintaining a second family for 2 decades, the concept of our family is a grotesque joke. I stepped back, maintaining the precise distance of a judge addressing a convicted criminal. You have until midnight to be gone. Or, I promise you, by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, every member of the bank's executive committee will have a detailed breakdown of your little slush fund. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, searching for a crack in my resolve. but all he found was a cold, impenetrable wall. The resolution of a woman who, at 52, had discovered her true, wounded strength. He didn't speak another word. He simply turned, his broad shoulders slumped, and slowly climbed the curving staircase. I listened to the sounds from our bedroom, drawers opening and slamming shut, the frantic rustle of clothes, the distinct, grating sound of suitcase zippers being pulled. 35 minutes later, he reappeared at the front door, looking suddenly frail and older than his years, holding 2 worn leather suitcases. His defeat was palpable. Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, the question laced with unexpected self-pity. I held the heavy oak door open, the cool evening air rushing in. "To your real family, Julian," I replied, my voice steady. "Isn't that exactly what you always wanted?" When the latch clicked shut behind him, sealing his exit, I finally let the facade crumble. I slid down the wall and allowed the wave of emotion to break over me, but they were not tears of sorrow for the lost husband. That grief would come later, mingled with a consuming righteous anger. At that moment, I cried with relief. The pure, searing relief of finally knowing the truth, no matter how profoundly painful it was. The gilded cage was finally open. I went upstairs, checking on Leo, my youngest, who was sleeping soundly, unaware of the domestic earthquake that had just shaken our foundation. Tomorrow, I would face the task of explaining his father's abrupt absence. Tomorrow, the process of rebuilding would begin. But that night, lying alone in the vast empty bed I had shared with a stranger for nearly 3 decades, I made a sacred promise to myself. From this moment on, my life would be guided only by unfiltered truth. No more illusions, no more self-imposed blindness. The path ahead was terrifyingly uncertain, but at least it would be a path I had chosen, alone and free. Dawn arrived with a heavy, unnatural quietness. Julian's absence was a physical void, a palpable cold spot in the heart of our beautiful, decaying home. I moved through the expansive kitchen, preparing Leo's breakfast, pancakes, his favorite, trying to project a sense of normal routine that no longer existed. "Where's Dad?" Leo asked, his 7-year-old eyes still heavy with sleep as he dragged his miniature chair up to the granite counter. It was the question I had dreaded most. How does one explain to a child that his father maintained a simultaneous, fully operational family, complete with a mortgage and dinner table conversation, for more than 2 decades? That those kids he saw at the farmer's market a few weeks ago were indeed his half-siblings, and the woman with them was the reason his father missed his last 2 school plays. "Dad had to go away on a long trip for work, sweetheart," I answered, the lie catching in my throat, tasting like ash. I despised the untruth, but the complete, brutal facts were too heavy for his small shoulders to carry right now. "A very long trip. We'll talk more about it later, when your sister and brother arrive." The lie was a necessary evil, a white flag to buy time, but I promised myself it would be the last one. My first actions of this new life had to be decisive and strategic. I called Victor and Clara immediately after dropping Leo off at the Willow Creek Elementary School. My voice, despite my efforts, must have carried the tremor of my distress because both promised to catch the first train home. Victor, my eldest, a pragmatic lawyer in the city, would arrive late in the afternoon. Clara, my introspective 25-year-old graduate student, abandoned her morning class and promised to be home by lunchtime. While I waited, I began executing my plan. Julian had always insisted the house was a joint asset, but the truth was, it was a wedding gift from my wealthy parents, discreetly placed solely in my name during the giddy days of our engagement, a fact Julian had quietly resented for years. The family's significant savings, however, were held in a joint investment account. I knew I had to act fast, before he could attempt to drain it in his panic. At 10:15 in the morning, I drove out of Willow Creek and across the county line to a competing bank branch in the next town, Riverton, where I was simply an anonymous woman, not Mrs. Julian Thorne. I opened a new account in my maiden name, Eleanor Vance. I then transferred exactly half of the liquid assets from the joint account into the new one. Not a penny more, not a penny less. Fair, I thought, considering he had supported his secret life with the other half of his executive salary, or worse, as the documents suggested, with funds illegally diverted from his clients. As I exited the bank, my heart still hammering against my ribs, I saw Genevieve Hayes, the wife of Julian's closest director, parking her massive black SUV. Our eyes met for a fleeting second. She quickly looked away, pretending to fumble with her car keys, refusing to acknowledge my existence. Strange, I thought. Genevieve was always aggressively social, the type who waved from 3 blocks away. It was my first chilling sign that the news was already leaking, spreading through the tight velvet corridors of Willow Creek society. Returning home, I found Clara already waiting. She was sitting on the wide front porch steps, the place where Julian had proposed 28 years ago, where we had taken every newborn photo, and where we had just celebrated our sham silver anniversary. Her face was tear-streaked and ravaged. My heart plummeted. She knew. "Dad," she began, her voice cracking the moment I reached the gate. "He has another family? Is it true, Mom?" We sank onto the porch swing, and I told her everything. Not the salacious details of the affair, but the cold, hard essentials. The 20-year double life. The 2 children, the impending divorce. "How did you find out?" she whispered, hugging her knees. I explained the mounting suspicions, the innocent comments from Leo, the silent, agonizing investigation that culminated in breaking the lock on the basement door. At the mention of the basement, a flash of understanding crossed her tear-filled eyes. "His late Tuesday night meetings," she murmured, the phrase heavy with old guilt. Clara confessed that when she was only 13, she had become suspicious. She had once hidden in the overgrown rhododendrons in the dark, just to see him leave. He hadn't driven to the bank. He had driven toward the highway. When she confronted him the next day, he manufactured a complex story about a confidential client in a neighboring city, then threatened to punish her severely if she ever spoke of it to me. "Forgive me." "Mom!" she cried, burying her face into my shoulder. "I should have told you. I kept his awful secret for so long. I held my brave, wounded daughter tightly. It was never your fault, my angel," I soothed, my own tears finally starting to fall. We were all victims in his elaborate web of lies. Victor arrived later that afternoon, his demeanor somber, his eyes burning with an intense, contained fury, a stark contrast to Clara's sadness. He was the protector, the pragmatist. "Where is he now?" he demanded, dropping his overnight bag hard onto the hardwood floor. "I assume in Stonehaven." "With them," I replied. "I'm going after him," he declared, his fists clenched, his jaw rigid. "No, Victor." I cut him off firmly, placing a hand on his arm. "That is not how we handle this. We are better than him. We will act with dignity and intelligence." That night, the 3 of us talked for hours, painstakingly planning how to explain the catastrophic shift to Leo and how we would begin to reconstruct a new life. We settled on the simplified narrative for the youngest. His father had gone to live in a different house with other people who needed him. The full, ugly truth would wait until he was older. While we spoke, the phone rang relentlessly. We didn't answer. We knew what it was. News travels at the speed of sound in Willow Creek, a town of only 15,000 affluent bored residents. The next morning confirmed my fears about the town's swift, cruel judgment. Taking Leo to school felt like walking a gauntlet. The looks, the abrupt, hushed silences when I approached a group of mothers at the school entrance, the pitying glances that sliced through my composure, everyone knew. Julian must have moved his belongings into Scarlett's house in Stonehaven so quickly that the neighbors noticed. Or the more chilling thought, he himself was already working hard to control the narrative, spreading a version of the story that cast him as the sympathetic, misunderstood victim of a sudden marital collapse. The confirmation came in the form of Dora Ellison, my neighbor and longtime coffee friend who knocked on my door early that afternoon, her eyes brimming with a mixture of genuine compassion and deep embarrassment. "Eleanor, are you all right? I've heard such strange, unsettling things. I invited her in." With Victor and Clara out resolving practical matters and Leo still at school, this was the first time I would speak about the subject to someone outside my immediate, shattered circle. What exactly are they saying, Dora? I asked directly, pouring her a cup of strong, dark coffee. She hesitated, meticulously stirring the cream into her cup, avoiding my eyes. They're saying Julian, that he resigned from the bank yesterday, that he's moving to Stonehaven, and some, she lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, even though we were alone in the vast living room, are saying he has another life there, a woman and children. So the private hell had become a public spectacle. Not only had I lost my husband, but my family had lost its sacred privacy. We were the scandal du jour, the subject of hushed conversations at the country club, the gossip fodder at the local bakery counter, and the cautionary tale at church exits. It's true. Dora, I confirmed, feeling a profound, strange relief in finally speaking the truth openly to the outside world. I discovered 2 days ago that Julian has maintained a double life for more than 20 years. Dora's eyes widened, confirming that hearing the gossip was one thing, but receiving the direct, unvarnished confirmation was another entirely. My God, Eleanor. And what are you going to do now? That was the quintessential million-dollar question, wasn't it? What does a woman, a newly minted 52-year-old, do after dedicating her entire adult existence to a partnership that turned out to be an exquisite, expensive fraud? What marketable skills did I possess beyond flawlessly managing a sprawling estate and raising 3 well-adjusted children? I am going to live, Dora, I replied, the firmness of my voice surprising even myself. It was a commitment, not just an answer. I am going to raise my youngest son, support my older ones, and secure a means of sustenance. I will not be defined by Julian's betrayal. Brave, resolute words, but they concealed an ocean of deep-seated insecurity. The truth was, I was utterly terrified. In the early 90s, a suddenly divorced woman still carried a heavy stigma. Particularly in a small, traditional town like Willow Creek, I would be pitied, viewed as the failure or worse for some malicious few, the wife who couldn't hold on to her powerful husband. How would I face the endless stream of sympathetic looks? How would I provide for Leo, who still needed years of care, tuition, and emotional stability? In the turbulent days that followed, these questions were a constant torment. Yet I also discovered an unexpected resilience, an inner bedrock of strength I never knew I possessed. The first major battle arrived a week after Julian's departure. In the form of a lawyer, a thin, severe man named Mr. Cross with small, circular glasses and a perpetually disapproving expression. He appeared at my door bearing a proposal for a quick, quiet settlement. Julian, through Mr. Cross, offered to completely relinquish his non-existent claim on the house in exchange for my guaranteed silence regarding the financial irregularities at the bank. Mr. Thorne is prepared to pay a reasonable sum for the minor's maintenance, Mr. Cross stated, carefully avoiding eye contact, provided Mrs. Thorne agrees to keep certain sensitive confidences. Blackmail, I thought, a bitter taste on my tongue. Even now, he was still attempting to manipulate the situation, leveraging my need for stability against his fear of exposure. Tell Mr. Thorne, I responded, emphasizing his formal title, that I do not negotiate with criminals. The alimony is my son's right, not a bargaining chip for my discretion. I straightened my spine. If he genuinely wants me to keep quiet about his fraudulent activities, he needs to do the morally correct thing and assume his full responsibilities as a father. Fairly and without coercion, Mr. Cross, visibly shaken by my unexpected firmness, quickly retreated. 2 hours later, the phone rang, Julian's number. It was the first direct contact since he had walked out. "Have you lost your mind, Eleanor?" He shrieked over the line, his voice vibrating with barely contained panic. "Do you know what happens if this information leaks? I could go to federal prison. You should have considered that before you began diverting funds from your clients' accounts, shouldn't you, Julian?" I retorted, surprised by the ice in my own voice. "I won't report you, not for your sake, but for our children's. I will not have them carry the stigma of a felon father." I paused, letting the silence convey the weight of my contempt. But I will not protect you in exchange for crumbs. I want a fair, proportional settlement based on your true executive salary, not the fraudulent numbers you report to the IRS. There was a long, deep silence on his end. And Scarlett? He finally asked, his voice suddenly smaller, more vulnerable. Her children? What becomes of them if I lose my job? The sheer audacity of the question was staggering. Was he truly expecting me to care about the welfare of the family he had built while demolishing mine? They are your problem, Julian, not mine, I responded, delivering the final decisive blow. You created this elaborate mess. Now you deal with the consequences. I hung up the phone, feeling a conflicting rush of guilt for being so harsh, and yet immense pride for finally drawing a clear, undeniable line in the sand. It was a baptism by fire. At 52, I was finally learning how to use the voice that had been dormant inside me for so long. In the tense months that followed, that newly discovered voice only grew stronger. Julian, desperate to avoid the financial scandal of a public lawsuit and the potential exposure of his crimes, agreed to a divorce settlement remarkably quickly. I received full custody of Leo, with highly supervised and scheduled paternal visitation rights. The financial settlement was generous by small-town standards, yet it was painfully insufficient to maintain the lavish, opulent lifestyle we had lived. I needed to work, but the question remained, doing what? My formal education had stopped with a college degree in art history, a subject charming for cocktail parties but utterly useless in the fiercely competitive job market of the early 90s. My practical skills were limited to high-level domestic management, organizing charity galas, and raising children, nothing that the commercial world placed any monetary value on. I felt profoundly unqualified for the reality of my new existence. It was Clara who suggested the unlikely solution one quiet Sunday evening. She was sitting with me, going through the stacks of old, forgotten photographs, when she picked up a faded picture of my Italian grandmother, Nonna Amelia, beaming beside a massive, multi-tiered wedding cake. "Mom," Clara began, looking up at me earnestly, "remember Nonna's legacy? Those incredible sweets you used to make for the church festivals? The pistachio fudge and the bourbon pecan delights? Everyone always complimented them. You could sell them." The idea seemed almost laughably simplistic at first. After fighting a Goliath of financial fraud and legal manipulation, selling fudge felt like retreating to the safety of a child's playhouse. But the more I entertained the notion, the more a profound, resonant sense of purpose began to form. I truly did have a unique, almost instinctual talent for confectionery, a rare gift inherited directly from my Nonna. My treats were always the first to disappear at every community event. They weren't just simple desserts. They were crafted with precision, rare ingredients, and an old-world passion. And in the kitchen, amidst the cloud of powdered sugar and the scent of melting Belgian chocolate, I felt truly happy, focused, and creatively alive. More importantly, I felt in control. Unlike my life with Julian, where I was merely a decorative accessory, the kitchen was my domain, ruled by my precision and taste. I started on a minuscule scale, baking personalized boxes of exotic treats for children's birthday parties. A few mothers from Leo's elementary school were my first tentative customers. Word of mouth, powered by the irresistible allure of high-quality sweets in a small town starved for gourmet fare, did the rest. I named the business Eleanor's Salted Caramels and Confections. Salted caramel, I decided, was the perfect symbol, sweet, yet possessing a sharp, necessary edge of salt, a metaphor for my new life. In just 6 months, Eleanor's was a recognized and highly sought-after brand in Willow Creek. The most poignant act of transformation was yet to come. The basement, that dark, musty place that for 25 years represented the tomb of Julian's secrets and lies, had a separate, secure entrance. It was large and naturally cool. After a week of relentless scrubbing and renovation, the space was utterly, profoundly transformed. Where Julian's old, clandestine maps of Stonehaven and boxes of illicit financial records once lay, now stood industrial shelving units stocked with imported vanilla beans, copper mixing bowls, and rows upon rows of my Nana's worn, annotated recipe books. The space was no longer a symbol of deception. It became the headquarters of my burgeoning small business. It was an act of profound, personal exorcism. Every single caramel that left that formerly forbidden space seemed to carry with it a bit of the old pain, transforming it through the alchemy of sugar and heat into something delightful, honest and nourishing. I won't pretend it was easy. There were countless nights when I cried myself to sleep, utterly exhausted from 16-hour days spent standing over a hot stove, my back aching, my hands burned by molten sugar. There were moments when the crushing loneliness of my sudden single status weighed on me like a granite slab. And there were occasions, rare but painful, when I saw Julian with Scarlett in town, quickly buying groceries or running an errand. The sight brought a conflicting mixture of cold anger, residual pain, and yet a vast, undeniable relief at no longer being a participant in his endless, exhausting fraud. But there were also unexpected, quiet joys, the fierce satisfaction of receiving my first large payment, earned entirely through the labor of my own two hands, the deep pride of watching Leo grow stronger and more balanced despite his father's distant absence, the sheer exhilarating freedom to make every single decision in my life, large or small, without needing to consult a man whose judgment I had learned to despise. Perhaps the most surprising discovery was the town's reaction. Willow Creek did not reject me as I had feared. On the contrary, after the initial storm of scandal had subsided, I received more support than I could have possibly imagined. Women who felt trapped in their own sterile marriages quietly started ordering my sweets, supporting poor Eleanor as a silent protest. Even some of Julian's former banking associates, men who knew the truth about his diversions and had protected him, became loyal customers of Eleanor's, buying expensive custom cakes as a silent acknowledgement of the institutional error they had committed by shielding a corrupt man for so long. 2 years after the separation, I received an offer to supply my renowned bourbon pecan delights to the most elegant, prestigious catering service in all of Willow Creek. It was my first major commercial contract, a pivotal moment. I remember sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had lived for so many years merely as Julian's wife, and realizing, with a sudden, profound clarity, that I no longer defined myself that way. I was Eleanor Vance, confectioner, entrepreneur, single mother, a woman who at 54 was finally living entirely on her own terms. The irony of Julian's eventual downfall was a lesson in unyielding cosmic justice. 6 months after our divorce was finalized and the legal dust settled, Julian lost his prestigious, high-paying position at the bank. It wasn't my doing. I had kept my word regarding the financial irregularities. The gods of consequence, however, had their own script. Scarlett, the woman he had lived with for 20 years and the mother of his 2 children, discovered that Julian was maintaining yet another relationship, a third existence, with a much younger financial analyst who worked on the bank's 12th floor. The resulting scandal was unavoidable, a sensational storm that ripped through the usually sedate offices of the institution. The directors who had for so long tolerated Julian's relatively quiet financial diversions could not possibly ignore this flagrant breach of professional ethics and moral conduct. Within the institution itself, he was forced to resign. Immediately, that was when the deepest, most fundamental truth about Julian Thorne, and perhaps about chronic betrayers everywhere, crystallized in my mind. The betrayal of me wasn't an isolated mistake, a momentary lapse of judgment in a difficult marriage. No, betrayal was part of the essence of who Julian truly was. His capacity for deception wasn't circumstantial. It was constitutional. People who build their lives on layers of lies rarely, if ever, change. Finally, free from that suffocating, intricate web of deceit, I could breathe without the suffocating weight of maintaining an illusion that had never truly belonged to me. Time, as it does when one is truly building something new, passed in a curious, contradictory manner. The days often felt endless, consumed by the frantic pace of production and the demands of raising a young son. Yet the years flew by. Between the endless batches of fudge and the urgent wedding cake deliveries, between attending Leo's soccer games and navigating the complex paperwork of my growing small business, I barely noticed that we were already in the year 1992. 5 turbulent, transformative years had passed since that defining night I broke open the basement door. My confectionery business, Eleanor's Salted Caramels and Confections, had grown far beyond my initial humble projections. From a makeshift kitchen in the basement, Eleanor's now occupied its own charming, standalone storefront downtown on Main Street. I employed 3 full-time staff members, all women like me, restarting their lives after divorce or personal setbacks. It was not a multinational corporation, of course, but it provided me with a decent, highly respected living and, most crucially, complete independence. Leo was now 12 years old, navigating the complicated, often turbulent phase between boyhood and adolescence. He suffered from his father's emotional absence. Julian rarely adhered to the visitation agreement, often canceling at the last minute or showing up hours late. When he did appear for important dates, birthdays, or school events, it was always with ostentatiously expensive gifts, as if material objects could ever fully substitute for genuine presence or lost time. After the dramatic bank scandal, Julian had moved with Scarlett and their children, Chloe and Jonas, to a less prestigious district in the city, where he attempted to start a small accounting consultancy. Based on sporadic reports from Victor, who maintained minimal obligatory contact with his father, the business was doing reasonably well, though it never achieved the success or prestige of his previous banking position. He was, to put it simply, diminished. Victor, my eldest, was now 34 and had flourished. He had married Gabriella, a brilliant pediatric surgeon he met during his residency at the city hospital. They were expecting their first child, which meant I was soon to become a grandmother, a milestone I had once thought Julian would share. Clara, at 30, was teaching art history at the local college of education and was newly engaged to Paul, a kind, grounded mathematics teacher. My older children had successfully navigated the wreckage of their parents' divorce. Despite the profound, lingering wound left by their father's betrayal, both had emerged as balanced, dedicated professionals, people of profound integrity. My life felt full, vibrant, and mine. The scars were still there, but they had faded from angry red to soft silver lines, permanent reminders of where I had been, but no longer dictating where I was going. I had built a legacy of sweetness from the bitter residue of a lie. It was in the summer of 1993, during a humid Thursday in July, that I received the phone call that would unexpectedly challenge the comfortable new boundaries of my rebuilt world. I was at the store, meticulously applying delicate fondant lace to a particularly complex 4-tiered wedding cake, when Marika, my assistant, called me to the phone in the back office. "Mrs. Vance," Marika whispered, her voice tinged with curiosity. "There's a young woman named Chloe Thorne on the line. She says it's very important, Chloe." The name was a punch to the gut. Chloe, Julian's daughter with Scarlett, the girl from the faded photograph in the basement, the child who, without knowing it, had shared her father with my children for so many years. My first, instinctual reaction was to refuse the call. What could I possibly say to her? What subject could we have in common besides the sprawling, painful betrayal that had indirectly connected all our lives? I had worked so hard to seal that chapter shut, but the unexpected nature of the call, coupled with the tremor of urgency in Marika's voice, ignited an irresistible spark of curiosity and something akin to dread. I reached for the receiver, my hand sticky with residual caramel. "Hello," I answered, my voice deliberately firm, a wall of cool professionalism I didn't entirely feel. "Mrs. Vance. I'm Chloe Thorne, Julian's daughter with Scarlett." "I know who you are." "Of course." The young voice on the other end was polite, well-spoken, yet laced with a clear thread of nervousness. "I also know who you are." "Chloe," I replied, my tone neutral, neither hostile nor warm. "What can I do for you? I'd like to speak with you, in person if possible." I know it's a strange request, but it's about Jonas, my brother. Jonas, the other child, the firstborn of the clandestine relationship. Has something happened to him? I asked, surprised by the swiftness and sincerity of my own concern. In that moment, he wasn't a symbol of betrayal. He was just a young man. He's in the hospital. He had a severe motorcycle accident. It's not life-threatening, but he paused, clearly searching for courage. He wants to meet his half-siblings. All of you. The accident. I think it made him think about connections he never fully had. I remained absolutely silent, absorbing those stunning, utterly unexpected words. The silence on the line stretched, thick and heavy with the weight of unsaid history. My mind was reeling. Meet Julian's other children? After years of painstakingly building a firewall between my life and the wreckage he created? Hadn't we all suffered enough trauma already? I thought about the potential fallout. I remembered Leo, who, even at 12, still carried the quiet hurt of his father's chronic unreliability. I thought about Victor, who, despite his success, still held the rigid, defensive posture of the eldest son who had to protect his family from an invisible enemy. And Clara, whose lingering trust issues in relationships, always fearing the inevitable, crushing betrayal her mother had endured, were still subtly present. Yet, a counter-thought insisted. I also pictured Chloe and Jonas, children who had grown up in a deceitful shadow, just as mine had. Children who undoubtedly suffered immensely when Julian finally chose to live openly with them, only to betray their mother, Scarlett, with a third woman shortly thereafter. Weren't they, too, victims of that man's fundamental inability to be faithful or true? Where is your brother hospitalized, Chloe? I finally asked, the pragmatic question cutting through the swirling emotional chaos. At St. Jude's Hospital in the city, room 14D. Her voice sounded immediately lighter, as if the request itself was the heaviest burden. I will think about your request, Chloe. I can't promise anything, and the decision will ultimately rest with my adult children. I understand, Mrs. Vance. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking my call. I hung up, feeling a vertigo of contradictory emotions. 7 years had passed, but the pain of Julian's initial betrayal lingered, a poorly healed wound that ached with every atmospheric change. Would it be fair to my children to force them in a way to confront the living, breathing reminders of their father's lie? Would it be emotionally healthy for Leo, in particular, who was still trying to rationalize the sporadic visits of a largely absent dad? I spent the entirety of that night reflecting, pacing the quiet moonlit floors of my home, a house that now felt fully and absolutely mine. I searched for guidance, not in the past, but in the future I wanted for my children, a future free from bitterness and the perpetual prison of resentment. The next day, a bright Friday morning, I gathered my 3 children in the spacious, sun-filled living room, the same room where we had celebrated countless Christmases, utterly unconscious of Julian's parallel, shadowed life. I received a phone call yesterday, I began, addressing them without preamble. It was from Chloe, Julian's daughter with Scarlett. I watched the immediate raw surprise flicker across their faces. In the 7 years since the divorce, we had maintained a determined silence about the other children. They were the unspoken taboo, the painful asterisk attached to every rare mention of Julian. I recounted the details of Jonas's accident, the hospital stay, and his sudden, compelling desire to meet his half-siblings. I reiterated that I had made no decision and that I would respect whatever they felt. This was a decision too delicate, too charged with personal history for me to impose from above. Victor was the first to speak, as always, the pragmatic anchor. He ran a restless hand through his dark hair before finding his voice. They aren't to blame for Dad's choices, Mom. We're all adults now, or nearly so. Maybe it's time to stop letting his actions control our ability to heal. If they're seeking connection, maybe we should offer it. Clara, the emotional core of the family, seemed far more hesitant. Her posture was tense, defensive. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Mom. Every time I think about Scarlett, about those children, it's like reliving the pain all over again. It feels like rewarding the betrayal. Leo, the preteen caught between two worlds, looked from his older siblings to me, his young face earnest. They are siblings too, aren't they? Half siblings, but they belong to our family tree. I want to meet them. His childlike simplicity and profound need for expanded kinship touched me deeply. For him, who had grown up virtually without a present father, the idea of having more siblings represented an expansion of family, not merely a painful reminder of his father's perfidy. The votes were in, 2 in favor, 1 hesitant, and 1 matriarch whose heart was quietly breaking open to the possibility of a shared future. The following Sunday, I drove the family car, a sensible sedan, not one of Julian's old, flashy sports cars, into the city. St. Jude's Hospital was an imposing, modern tower downtown, a jarring contrast to the small, familiar community hospital in Willow Creek. In the elevator, I caught myself nervously smoothing the fabric of my dress, checking my reflection. Why do I care about my appearance? I chastised myself. I am here to facilitate healing, not to impress anyone. Room 14. D had its door slightly ajar. Inside, a handsome young man, approximately 22 years old, was sitting up in bed, his right leg encased in a heavy cast and elevated by a support sling. Beside him sat a girl I instantly recognized as Chloe, older than in the basement photo, but possessing the same delicate, refined features as Scarlett. When we entered, both young people looked up in our direction. There was a moment of heavy, loaded silence, the kind of silence that seems to weigh several tons and stretches into a terrifying eternity. "You came," Chloe finally whispered, the relief so profound that tears immediately welled in her eyes. "We may be a broken family," I interrupted, my voice clear and resonating with all the dignity I could muster. "But we are still decent people, Jonas." The patient offered a sad, grateful smile. "Thank you for coming. Especially you, Mrs. Vance. I know this must have been the hardest decision you've ever made." In the sincerity of that young man, my last defenses crumbled. This wasn't Julian, manipulative, arrogant, and false. This was simply a young man who, like my own children, was grappling with the profound, complicated consequences of a selfish father's choices. The hours that followed were strange, highly emotional, and deeply transformative. They were tense at certain points, surprisingly light and humorous at others. We navigated the treacherous terrain of shared paternity with cautious, deliberate respect. Victor, ever the lawyer, began by laying out ground rules, emphasizing that the focus should be on the siblings' relationship, entirely separate from the mother's history. Clara was reserved, observing from the perimeter, guarded but not hostile. Leo, however, broke the ice with his characteristic disarming simplicity. "So, do you like soccer?" he asked Jonas, perched innocently on the edge of the hospital chair. Jonas, whose leg was encased in the massive plaster cast, laughed, a genuine warm sound. "Well, I did, before this bad boy betrayed me. What team do you follow?" The conversation quickly flowed from the vast chasm of their shared trauma to the infinitely safer harbors of pop culture and school gossip. We discovered small, curious coincidences that chipped away at the wall separating us. Jonas, despite his imposing stature, shared the exact same debilitating kiwi allergy as Victor. Chloe and Clara, who had initially eyed each other with suspicion, quickly bonded over a shared, intense passion for Russian literature, debating the merits of Tolstoy versus Dostoevsky with academic fervor. Leo and Jonas, separated by a full decade, had precisely identical obscure tastes in indie rock music. These small, shared traits, these genetic whispers from a man they all called Dad, were a poignant reminder that, despite the manufactured separation, they were fundamentally linked. Julian's attempt to create two distinct, sealed-off worlds had failed, and in his failure, a new, complex connection was being forged. When we finally left St. Jude's Hospital in the late afternoon, something fundamental had subtly, irrevocably changed. We were not instantly friends. We were certainly not a seamlessly unified family, but we had crossed an agonizing, seemingly impassable bridge. We had acknowledged the shared reality of our fragmented existence. In the ensuing years, the 5 siblings began developing their own independent relationships, entirely separate from Julian's sporadic involvement or my cautious oversight. Sometimes Jonas would drive out to Willow Creek and join us for a noisy, chaotic, and very real Sunday dinner in the kitchen. Chloe and Clara maintained a regular correspondence, exchanging books, academic papers, and candid impressions of their favorite, often deeply troubled, Russian authors. When Victor and Gabriella had their first child, a little girl named Amelia, both Chloe and Jonas were invited to the christening. They stood politely, yet firmly, alongside their half-siblings, an undeniable presence in our evolving family portrait. Scarlett and I never became friends. The wounds were too profound, the foundation of the relationship too toxic for any kind of genuine friendship to bloom. But when we encountered each other at the children's joint events, we managed to maintain a polite, strained cordiality. She, too, had been betrayed by Julian, and in that shared, agonizing experience, we had a painful, silent bond. As for Julian, his narrative did not enjoy the clean, redemptive arc of a fictional character. After his betrayal of Scarlett, he descended into a series of brief, shallow, and increasingly troubled romantic relationships. The accounting consultancy he started with his diminished capital failed spectacularly in 1997, collapsing under the weight of his mismanagement and the lingering stigma from his previous scandal. He made token, desperate attempts to reconcile with all his children, all 5 of them, but the emotional and financial wounds he had inflicted were far too deep to mend with superficial efforts. He visited them sporadically, always attempting to purchase affection with obscenely expensive, last-minute gifts, failing to grasp the simple, devastating truth that lost time has no price tag and true affection cannot be bought. In the year 2000, 7 years after the siblings' first meeting, I received another call from Chloe. Her voice this time was heavy, hollowed out by grief and shock. Julian had suffered a massive, debilitating heart attack at the age of 67. He had died completely alone in his cramped, one-room apartment on the outskirts of the city. His neighbors only noticed his absence after 3 days had passed. The funeral was a profoundly strange, emotionally complex affair. We were all there, me, my 3 children, Scarlett, Jonas, and Chloe. We were united not by love, but by the physical absence of the very man who, during his life, had done everything in his considerable power to keep us permanently separate and fragmented. Looking at that simple, unadorned coffin, I felt an intense, powerful mixture of emotions that, to this day, I can't fully categorize. It was no longer hatred, and certainly not love. Perhaps it was just a quiet, profound understanding, the understanding that Julian, despite his brilliance and charm, was merely a deeply flawed, irreparably broken man who had spent his entire life desperately trying to find happiness and fulfillment in the most misguided, treacherous way possible. And in the wake of his relentless failure, a strange, beautiful new constellation of people, our family, had formed whole and true in the shattered remnants of his deceit. The years continued their steady march, transforming the bitter landscape of my past into fertile ground for my future. It is true what they say. Time operates in curious ways when one is actively rebuilding. The days are a blur of unrelenting effort and small victories, yet the decades seem to vanish in the blink of an eye. This was my life. Between the industrial-sized batches of pistachio fudge and the urgent consultations for custom cakes, between Leo's high school applications and the endless worries about securing the next major catering contract, I barely noticed that we had already crossed into the year 2005. 13 years had passed since the night I broke the lock on the basement door. My small confectionery empire, Eleanor's salted caramels and confections, had expanded far beyond the cramped confines of the basement and the single Main Street storefront. We were now the undisputed regional standard for high-end, bespoke sweets, operating out of a newly renovated, light-filled facility on the edge of Willow Creek's commercial district. I employed 10 full-time staff, all skilled artisans, a beautiful collective of women, each with her own complex story of resilience and renewal. It wasn't a corporate giant, of course, but it afforded me a deeply comfortable living and, far more valuable than any currency, unshakable economic independence. Leo was now 19, a handsome young man caught between his passion for music and his innate talent for business. Despite the pain of his father's emotional neglect, he had grown into a surprisingly well-adjusted, empathetic, and stable adult. Julian's sporadic appearances, often accompanied by his expensive, meaningless gifts, had eventually faded entirely, replaced by the steady, loving presence of his half-siblings Victor and Clara, and the new friends he had made. Victor, my eldest, was now 41. He and Gabriella had given me 3 beautiful, rambunctious grandchildren, Amelia, now 8, little Thomas, who was 6, and baby Charlotte. Victor's life was a testament to the fact that one can overcome the worst childhood betrayals to build a life founded on honesty and profound commitment. Clara, now 37, was a tenured professor at the university. Known for her sharp intellect and deep kindness, she and Paul had 2 children, my beloved grandchildren, 2-year-old Penelope and 4-year-old Henry. Even Jonas and Chloe, the children I had once feared and seen as direct symbols of my suffering, had become inextricable threads in the tapestry of our extended family. Jonas, having fully recovered from his accident, had found his calling as an architectural draftsman and, in a curious, delightful irony of fate, had married a distant cousin of Victor's wife, Gabriella. Chloe, the bookworm, had become an academic and eventually accepted the honor of being godmother to Clara's youngest daughter. I realized, with a profound sense of awe, that the broken fragments of my family had not been thrown away. They had been lovingly gathered and reassembled into something entirely new, something stronger and more complex than the original, fragile structure. The call from Chloe about Julian's lonely passing in 2000 had been a moment of final closure. At the funeral, I had felt only understanding, recognizing that Julian was merely a man trying to find happiness in the most disastrous, self-sabotaging way possible. The years had washed away the hatred, leaving only a clear, objective view of a tragic figure. My confectionery had prospered, becoming a recognized culinary landmark in the entire region. Leo, after an initial period of youthful indecision, had chosen to follow my path, entering a prestigious culinary arts program and gradually taking over the complex business administration. It was a beautiful passing of the torch. I remember one quiet afternoon, sitting alone in my office, which was now located in the sunny front part of my old house. At 61, I was finally slowing down, delegating more, and reflecting more. I looked back at that terrible night 13 years ago, the night I broke into the basement door, and realized it wasn't the agonizing end of a chapter, but the fierce, necessary opening of a completely new book. It was a narrative of profound reconstruction, self-discovery, and perhaps most importantly, forgiveness. Not forgiveness for Julian. He never sought it, nor did he deserve it. But forgiveness for myself. For all the long years I had chosen to look the other way, chosen not to question the small, subtle anomalies in my marriage, and chosen not to live fully in my own truth. The basement, which had once represented 25 years of carefully maintained secrecy and lies, had become the true, honest cradle of my financial independence. The betrayal, which could have utterly destroyed my self-worth and my family, had instead become the brutal catalyst for forging a life that was finally authentic, fulfilling, and completely mine. I often reflect on the incredible, unexpected irony of my late-life success. I had always feared that Julian's actions would forever define me. I worried about the social stigma in a close-knit community like Willow Creek, imagining myself permanently branded as the abandoned wife. Yet the opposite occurred. The moment I chose to confront the lie and step into my own devastating truth, the town, and indeed my own life, responded with unexpected grace. The betrayal did not destroy me. It clarified my path. It taught me a fundamental, unyielding truth. We do not control what happens to us, but we retain absolute power over how we choose to react to it. I could have chosen to crumble. I could have settled for the lawyer's initial meager offer, accepting Julian's blackmail in exchange for comfort and silence. I could have retreated into victimhood, letting bitterness consume my days, allowing the trauma to define my relationship with my children and the world. But I didn't. I chose the fierce, agonizing path of truth and self-reliance. That decision, the singular, powerful choice to demand a fair settlement and, more importantly, to start my own business, was the key that unlocked my prison door. The real prison, I realized with the wisdom of hindsight, was never Julian's fraudulent marriage or the judgmental whispers of a small town. The real prison was my own deep-seated fear of living entirely on my own terms. It was the fear of failure, the fear of poverty, and the fear of social exposure. But when Julian's betrayal violently stripped away all the comfortable lies, I was left with nothing but the necessary raw material of survival: my dignity, my children, and the forgotten skill of my Italian grandmother. The transformation of the basement remains the most profound metaphor of my journey. Every single day for years I descended those steps into the space that held the ghosts of Julian's double life. And every day, I worked to purify it, replacing the stale air of deception with the vibrant, life-affirming aromas of cinnamon, chocolate, and sugar. The basement was no longer a symbol of betrayal. It was the founding sanctuary of my financial independence. Every dessert that left that space carried a piece of my self-discovery, transforming pain into something universally sweet and nourishing. It was my unique form of alchemy. The gradual, successful integration of Julian's 5 children into a single, cohesive unit became the greatest proof of my redemption. My initial fear of Chloe and Jonas was not about them as individuals. It was about what they represented, the raw, bleeding evidence of my decades-long delusion. Yet they turned out to be 2 of the most wonderful, kind-hearted people I have ever known, simply seeking connection and clarity in the wake of their own father's destruction. They did not steal my family's past. They enriched our present and expanded our future. I recall a moment, years later, at Victor's 40th birthday party. The house was full of laughter, the smell of my gourmet appetizers, and the chaos of 5 rambunctious grandchildren. Julian, of course, was gone, a silent memory. I looked across the room and saw Victor, Clara, and Leo standing shoulder to shoulder with Jonas and Chloe. They were joking, arguing affectionately, deeply and truly connected by shared history, shared genes, and shared healing. They were a family, and I, the woman who had feared her world was ending, had presided over its complex, beautiful rebirth. I broke that basement door down more than 2 decades ago, not merely to expose the truth about my husband, but to free myself from the invisible chains I had helped forge through years of willful blindness. The emotional freedom that followed has been worth every single tear shed, every sleepless night, and every agonizing new beginning. Because, in the end, it is not the years of suffering that define the narrative of our lives, but those singular, decisive moments of immense courage when we choose the difficult, undeniable truth over the comfortable, soul-crushing lie. And in that choice, we discover not just who we truly are, but the extraordinary, resilient person we were always destined to become. By the time I reached my early 70s, the confectionery business was thriving, recognized statewide, and running almost entirely under the skilled direction of my son, Leo. He had returned from culinary school with a passion not just for sweets, but for savory pastry and business management. Eleanor's salted caramels had evolved into Eleanor's fine confections and gourmet pantry, catering to an even more exclusive, high-end clientele. It was a beautiful thing to witness. My son, the innocent victim of his father's emotional abandonment, now fully in control of a successful, honest legacy. I remember the day he formally bought me out, ensuring my comfortable retirement while keeping the business name and core values intact. He presented the documents to me, smiling that warm, genuine smile that was entirely his own, untouched by Julian's cold ambition. "Mom," he said, leaning across the massive oak desk that once belonged to Julian, a subtle irony I cherished. "You built this from nothing. You built it from a lie and turned it into the most honest thing in our lives. Thank you." Receiving that final payment, a sum far exceeding the entire capital Julian had once controlled, was a profound moment of closure. The number, $2 million, represented not wealth, but absolute unassailable victory over my past. My relationship with my children only deepened as the years progressed. Victor, the protector, often visited, still checking on my well-being, though now his concern was laced with admiration rather than pity. Clara, the reflective historian, often interviewed me for her academic projects on women's entrepreneurship and midlife career shifts, meticulously documenting my journey from betrayed wife to successful CEO. The inclusion of Jonas and Chloe into our extended family became completely seamless. They were simply Aunt Chloe and Uncle Jonas to my 5 grandchildren. They never spoke ill of Julian, choosing instead to focus on the future and the connections they had gained. They had their own healing process with Scarlett, their mother, a process that I respected and understood implicitly. Scarlett, too, had managed to rebuild her life, finding a quiet, peaceful second marriage after Julian's relentless betrayals finally ended. The physical space of my life also underwent a final, symbolic transformation. With Leo fully running the business in the commercial district, the main house in Willow Creek became my personal sanctuary once more. I converted the basement, the now vacant headquarters of my former business, into a proper sunlit studio. No more commercial ovens or industrial mixers, just easels, canvases, and oil paints. I finally returned to the art history passion of my youth, painting abstracts that spoke to the complex geometry of memory, loss, and recreation. I found a new, quiet purpose in my 70s and 80s. I was a grandmother, an artist, a retired entrepreneur, and occasionally, a candid speaker at local women's groups, sharing the raw, unvarnished story of my unexpected late-life liberation. My message was always the same. The biggest risk in life is not facing failure. It's failing to face the truth. I learned that true dignity is not about maintaining a perfect facade. It is about the messy, painful, honest work of rebuilding after the collapse. It's about standing in the dust of your ruins and declaring, I will build something new here. And this time, it will be made of solid truth. Julian's tragedy, his ultimate loneliness, became a cautionary tale that offered its own strange form of justice. He died believing that money, prestige, and constant novelty could buy happiness. He never understood that the true sources of life's fulfillment are simple. The steady, honest love of family, the quiet pride of meaningful work, and the absolute freedom that comes from a life lived without the suffocating weight of a secret. His life was a perpetual search for what he lacked internally, a pursuit that only led to exhaustion and isolation. My life, born from his lie, became a testament to the profound power of self-reliance, integrity, and the enduring, quiet miracle of human resilience. I now sit on my porch, surrounded by the laughter of my grandchildren and the gentle scent of roses blooming in the garden, and I often feel a profound, calm gratitude for the entire journey. I wouldn't wish the pain of Julian's betrayal on anyone. But if there is one thing I know for certain, it is that sometimes the most catastrophic endings are precisely the beginnings we were always destined to have. The final act of profound healing wasn't the sale of the business or Julian's death. It was the ability to fully, genuinely forgive myself. I spent many years, particularly in the initial aftermath of the divorce, wrestling with a consuming sense of self-reproach. Why had I been so blind? Why did I, a woman of sharp intellect, choose to ignore the blatant signs, the unexplained trips, the guarded phone calls, the subtle shift in intimacy? I feared I was complicit in my own delusion, a voluntary captive in the gilded cage. My daughter Clara, the historian, helped me frame this internal struggle in a healthier context. "Mom," she once said gently, "you didn't choose to be deceived. You chose to trust. You committed to a marriage built on a foundation you believed to be true. His deceit was his moral failing, not yours. Your fault, if there was one, was only believing too fiercely in the sanctity of your shared commitment, and there is no crime in that." That conversation, more than any legal document or financial success, finally unlocked the last, smallest door to my own heart. I ceased punishing myself for the years of willful blindness. I recognized that the energy I had once spent agonizing over the past was now needed to savor the present. As I moved into my 80s, my painting became a deep meditative practice. I specialized in what I called reconstruction abstracts. They weren't smooth or seamless. They were explosions of color and texture, marked by clear, deliberate, broken lines. Lines that represented the divorce, the betrayal, and the painful separation. Yet the colors were vibrant, rich in gold and sapphire, representing the strength and the new family bonds that grew from the rupture. One painting, which hangs prominently in the local gallery, is titled The Unlocked Door. It features a dark, recessed shape, the basement door, but the center is a brilliant burst of light, a starburst of yellow and orange, signifying the moment of truth. It is a visual representation of my life's core lesson. The darkness we fear most is often the precursor to the greatest light. My life, now lived out with the quiet comfort of routine and the joy of a bustling, blended family, is a testament to the fact that you can truly begin again, even when the clock seems to be against you. I started my business at 52, a time when many of my peers were considering slowing down. I faced financial ruin, social stigma, and profound loneliness, yet I persevered, and the reward was not the wealth or the accolades. The reward was the simple, profound ability to look in the mirror every morning and recognize a woman who is completely, authentically herself. Chloe, now a successful academic and a close friend to Clara, often brings her own children, my beautiful grandnieces and nephews, to visit. They play happily with Victor's and Clara's children. They all call me Grandma Eleanor. The lines of legitimacy, of us and them, blurred and then beautifully dissolved over time. Julian's children became my children's siblings, and their children, my grandchildren's cousins. The connection is pure, honest, and entirely without the bitter stain of the past. The irony of Julian's life, ending in isolation while mine blossomed into a rich, interconnected tapestry, is the universe's final, quiet comment on integrity versus deceit. He sought to divide and conquer, but his failure created a whole greater than the sum of its original. Broken parts. I often think about the woman I was on that night, standing in the basement clutching the folder. She was frightened, naive, and fiercely protective. I am grateful to her courage. Without her desperate act, the Eleanor of today, calm, successful, and deeply content, would never have existed. She made a choice that night not just for her children, but for her own soul. To anyone reading this story, anyone facing their own moment of truth, their own proverbial locked door, know that the fear is temporary, but the freedom that comes from choosing honesty is eternal. Do not let the comfortable lie chain you to a life that isn't yours. Break the lock. Step into the light. The life waiting for you on the other side is the one you deserve. The final chapter of my story isn't about an ending. It's about a legacy built not on a bank statement, but on a shelf of artisanal caramel. I am 86 years old now. I sit in my sun-drenched studio, surrounded by the scent of turpentine and old wood, and I feel a profound sense of completeness. The house in Willow Creek, the site of my greatest betrayal and my greatest triumph, is now home base for a thriving, complex, and beautiful extended family. Eleanor's fine confections continues to flourish, a symbol of self-reliance run beautifully by my son, Leo, and soon to be inherited by his own daughter, my granddaughter Amelia, who has a knack for complex flavor profiles. I often reflect on the simple, yet powerful, lessons I learned the hard way. The betrayal taught me to trust my instincts. The divorce taught me my own worth was independent of a man's name or his bank account. The failure of Julian's life taught me that integrity is the only currency that truly matters in the long run. The children of the other woman, whom I initially feared would forever poison my peace, ended up enriching our fragmented world beyond measure. They are family. They showed me that healing is not about exclusion, but about the willingness to connect with others who share a similar, painful human experience. I don't romanticize suffering. I would have chosen 1,000 times over to have had an honest, simple marriage from the very beginning. But if there is one central lesson I can impart from my 86 years on this earth, it is this. You cannot control the storm that breaks your life, but you retain absolute control over how you choose to sail the pieces of your wreckage. My act of breaking that basement door lock all those decades ago wasn't just to reveal Julian's truth. It was the ferocious act of freeing myself from the invisible chains I had, through complacency, helped to forge. And in that agonizing, messy process, I discovered that the real, enduring prison was never the fraudulent marriage or the petty judgments of a small provincial town. The true soul-crushing prison was the fear of living completely and bravely on my own terms, without the false shield of a powerful husband. So, if you are listening to this story, if you are watching this video, perhaps facing your own locked door, your own deeply buried secret, your own truth you are terrified to confront, remember my journey. The truth, when you finally speak it, will feel like a fire tearing through your veins. It may hurt like hell at first. It will demand tears and sleepless nights and a terrifying, painful new beginning. But the freedom that comes afterward, the quiet, profound peace of living in alignment with your own soul, oh, the freedom is worth every single sacrifice. It is worth every tear shed, every exhausted moment of labor, and every dollar earned through the honest sweat of your brow. Because in the end, it is not the years of endurance that define the powerful, viral narrative of your life, but the single, electric, incandescent moments of courage when you choose the difficult truth over the comfortable lie. And in that pivotal choice, you will discover not just who you really are, but the extraordinary, resilient person you have always been capable of becoming. If this story, the tale of how a salted caramel confectioner found her voice and rebuilt her world from the ashes of betrayal, touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the further life lessons and hard-won wisdom I have collected. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What is the biggest locked door you are preparing to break down in your own life? Your interaction means the world to me and helps this message of strength and resilience reach other women who desperately need to hear it. Thank you for listening to me today, and until the next time, choose courage.